Welcome, everyone, to Advantage and Alloy Partners podcast. I am Drew Buechler, our VP of Marketing here at Alloy Partners, and your host of this podcast, Advantaged. We are a venture builder, and we partner with organizations and entrepreneurs to co-create startups and venture studios to unlock growth and transformation. And on the podcast, we interview corporate innovators, founders, and investors all around venture building, startup corporate partnerships, and telling the stories of how corporates and startups win together, particularly through this unique model around venture studios and venture building. And today we have a really special episode. I am very excited to welcome Dr. Constanze Coelsch-Foisner, a postdoc researcher at MIT Sloan, who studies a lot around how these breakthrough ideas actually get commercialized, specifically through this lens of deep tech and venture building. She has been working on research around this for many years, both at MIT and previously. And so I'm really excited to talk a little bit about that research and your background, and in particular, how this is being applied around deep tech. So thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. To open us, I'd love to hear more about your background. You started in petroleum engineering, if I'm correct, moved through physics and are now at MIT. Tell us a little more about your journey and what's kept pulling you to this intersection between science and entrepreneurship and science and startup building, really.
So I actually got into business because my high school economics teacher told me that I was a strategic thinker. And I ended up taking a bunch of classes in university between science and business. Amongst them were astrophysics and energy politics. I then ended up briefly working at an oil company. And I quickly realized that I was actually more interested in the application side of things and on the macro scale as well. And I was also more interested in different kinds of technologies that were a little bit more resilient and a little bit more self-sufficient. And then after my master's, I was thinking which direction I wanted to go into, whether that was astrophysics or actually business. And I ended up reconnecting with my university professor. And I was offered a PhD at ETH at MTech, which is short for Management Technology and Economics. And so that ended up being an easy choice to do the PhD. And I've always operated from the thought of you cannot have business without science. And these two, for me, fundamentally go together. And if you combine them actually in a way that makes sense, the possibilities are really big. So I think, though, that why a lot of these sort of science-driven businesses, why they fail is because there are allocation and coordination issues. And I think the question is really, how do you combine scientific research with entrepreneurship in a way where you can bring these scientific inventions to the market to actually tackle these really big challenges? And yeah, for me, it really was just a way to bring these two things together, because I believe that venture studios are such a model to help us coordinate and allocate resources efficiently.
Yeah, and it brings us into our connection. You recently published a paper and some research that you have been working for many years with Fiona Murray at MIT. It's been 5 years in the making, many conversations, many studio that you've researched across continents and sectors. Recent paper, at least that you published, we were sharing it around, and for the framework that you put together and the paper. And so that's how we got connected, just talking about research. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking more about this. And before maybe we get into kind of the framework, just what made you spend the last 5 years working around this particular question of building startups within venture studios, and what's surprised you the most maybe out of what you found?
So we just published this article that is based on my research from 65 venture studios and 100 plus conversations in the Sloan Management Review. And so that was really a way for us to showcase how can leaders decide under what circumstances a venture studio makes them. My initial motivation to spend 5 years on that was actually quite ambitious. I wanted to understand if we can systematize entrepreneurship, because if we can do that, then we can actually say that venture creation can move from this sort of rare founder-dependent event to something that can be done organizationally and systematically. And that opens up a lot of possibilities. And that sort of brings me back to the allocation coordination aspect. That's also how I got really interested in corporate innovation, because I realized that corporates and large organizations they often have the resources required to fund innovation. But a lot of times they get stuck in what we call the innovator's dilemma, which means that they have the resources to do a lot of things, but these resources are not coordinated or allocated efficiently. And then so venture building can actually be applied to that dilemma. And I mean, we've seen a lot of different solutions come out over time that is also trying to tackle that dilemma, from corporate venture capital to corporate accelerators and incubators and hackathons. And there's so many things that corporates dabble with. But we see that most corporates actually have an innovation function. And the real question is how, based on your strategic goals and your resources, how do you execute innovation in your organization? In terms of the surprising insight, I wouldn't say that it was surprising, because it is all quite aligned with the innovator's dilemma. So one thing that I will say is the patterns that I've realized is that when things go wrong, they tend to spiral. And well, that compounds. And it's the thinking that the worse it gets, the worse it gets, the better it gets, the better it gets. But it is all amplified by this sort of irrational actor, which is the human being. And what I realized is that you can have all the structures in place, and you can have, in theory, the perfect venture studio and corporate internal innovation unit. But if you don't have the people who can actually execute in a way that moves the team forward, it's not going to work. And I also realized how siloed large organizations are, and how siloed the knowledge and the people in these organizations is. I have a sense that has become a little bit more complex with sort of working from home and flexible work structures, which is good in some ways, but it also creates more challenges for teams to work together. Another thing I've realized is that just the term venture studio is just ill-defined. And so everything is labeled a venture studio, right? And an accelerator that is actually an accelerator is a venture studio, and there's a lot of noise and hype around it. And that actually scares investors sometimes, because they don't know what they're investing in. Is it an asset class, or is it just a mislabeled accelerator? And so part of my work was also just really trying to bring clarity into that. And it is, from a research perspective, a very new and understudied phenomenon. I think in practice, we've seen similar things happen, but they have been labeled differently.
I completely agree. I think the term venture studio has been completely disassociated, kind of, at least my thinking and definition of the term. And I think partly there's a handful of reasons, but one of the reasons I believe is that anyone can call themselves a venture studio because it's amorphous almost. And you think about a venture fund, very clear definitions. Not anything can be a venture fund. It's actually regulated in a very specific function, even from the SEC, where like a venture studio can be an agency that just calls itself a venture studio and is a product design agency, where a venture fund is very concrete around there are assets under management. You are usually managing other people's money. You are deploying those assets. You know, there's a very standard business model, 2 and 20 from a management fee. And, you know, this follows very traditional patterns funneling up into private equity as a holistic class. And venture studio industry, if we want to call it, or asset class, but I think because it doesn't have much of the structure around it, people have been able to use the term however they would like. And so I do think that's become a challenge. And in my mind, at least, but I'd love to hear your definition as well. But I think the most simplest definition of a venture studio is a company that systematically creates new startups from scratch. And I think the main kind of definition and core components of that are creating startups from scratch with built-in capital. There have been incubators and things like that over the years, startup studios, but they haven't had built-in capital deployment to invest in those entities from the beginning. And I think that's where the venture part of a venture studio comes from. And the studio part is this idea of starting companies from scratch, usually ideas that are generated within the studio itself. But anyway, that's always been my definition. So I see lots of uses of the word venture studio. I know what your research is now found. Some people say there's 1,000+ venture studios around the world that are operating. Of those, how many kind of fit the definition of have they launched more than one net new startup with capital attached. I don't know how many kind of fit into that, but I do think it's been a challenge. What is the end goal of all of these together? And sometimes when we're talking about venture building and running a venture studio, we're not talking about the same things in this world.
I think that's right. And that's why I think the definition is actually really important to get right. And I agree with you on that. It is around creating companies from scratch. And we had sort of a thought of venture studios that create de novo and de alio, meaning that some really create from nothing and they hire founders. So we just published a paper in the Journal of Business Venturing on that called Founders for Hire. And that is quite interesting, right? Because no other organization does that. And that's really the thing that sets a venture studio apart, actually. Whereas if you have the de alio, meaning building from something, you often have founders coming to the venture studio with an already idea, and the venture studio scales it or takes it a step further. And I think that's probably more similar to what we see accelerators do. Doesn't mean that doesn't make it a venture studio. It's just, to us, it's a different type of venture studio. And then if we think about deep tech, that's really around IP and who owns IP, who generates IP, who translates it. And so we came up with this sort of terminology of IP translating, IP generating, and service providing studios. For me, a venture studio, in addition to creating companies from scratch, it is around the recombination of ideas, people, and resources in a way that creatively changes something initial, right? It can be initial, it can be really from scratch. And so it is a very dynamic model, which comes with its own challenges because it can be adapted to different contexts and people interpret it differently. And that doesn't mean it's not a venture studio. It's just a different interpretation or adaptation of the model. But I think, getting the sort of key pillars in place and getting that right is actually very important so that we speak the same language, right?
How are we comparing apples to apples in the asset class as a whole?
Yes.
In the MIT Sloan paper that you all recently published, you talk about the three core resources, three core inputs, talent, IP, and market insights that organizations have. You say that most organizations don't honestly assess which of these they have, and maybe even they may have them, but maybe they might not be able to effectively leverage them or use them or have access to them in the right way. So maybe walk me through those kind of core inputs a little more and help me understand, what does it look like when an organization has genuinely identified these resource advantages versus when they're just telling themselves that they have these?
So our point was that one of these resources is necessary but not sufficient to start a venture studio. And maybe we can link the article as well if that's possible. But most organizations, as you said too, they don't actually take a hard look at what they have, what they don't have, and they assume they have all of them, but that's almost never happens. So talent, for example, it's not just about having smart people. It's about having people who can actually operate entrepreneurially under uncertainty and build something new. And so the way you would see that is by doing internal capability assessments. You would try to identify teams that have excess capacity, maybe excess technical capacity. They have very specialized knowledge or repeatable excess know-how that can be identified. And also talent is actually a really hard one because a lot of people have told me, if there's people in the organization that are entrepreneurial, why don't they just do it somewhere else? That doesn't make sense. Why would they be in a corporate in the first place? And I've made the discovery that there is actually genuinely entrepreneurial talent in an organization. It's just a matter of drawing them out. And I think a venture studio can be a way to actually help internal entrepreneurial talent create something that aligns with their entrepreneurial goals so that you don't lose such talent. And I think ASML, for example, and Philips, they have a venture studio called High Tech XL. It's in the Netherlands. They've done a very good job at that, where you have internal employees who are engaged in the venture studio. They are very interested in helping the studio succeed, not just with internal IP, but also with technical know-how from the corporate. And then at the same time, you also have a trajectory for entrepreneurial individuals to move towards entrepreneurship in that venture studio. The second one was intellectual property. And so that is around having technologies or knowledge that is differentiated or underutilized. So these are things that you think can be translated into real world applications, but haven't yet been translated. And one thing that corporates do is actually they do IP auditing and sort of portfolio audits of underutilized technologies. We say that, for example, for Proto Ventures, which is the MIT's internal venture studio, we said that it's around 70 to 90 technologies that a venture builder can assess per year. So if you don't reach that capacity, it probably doesn't make sense to engage a venture builder or an EAR. Nokia Bell Labs also did something very similar. They have a lot of technologies. They don't really know how to market or commercialize them. So they brought in EIRs to actually help them identify where a good place in the market would be for their technologies. And market insights are the third one. And that's really around having unique access to data, customer problems, or patterns that others simply don't have. And our example in the paper was Chalou, which is a Middle Eastern retailer of luxury goods. And so they have a lot of insights from around 400 clients to build these ventures based on their strategic priorities. The way you would assess if you have that is if you have proprietary data sets, certain usage patterns, or operational signals that your competitors don't have. I think an advantage is always something that is identifiable, measurable, and differentiated. So it's just not enough to say, oh, we have great people and we have some patents lying around that we think we should do something with. The question is really around whether those resources can serve as the foundation for building new companies. And then you might have to bring in external talent to identify that, like an EIR or a venture builder.
You talk a little bit about it's rare for an organization to have all three internally, that the most effective studios are hybrids, bringing in what they're missing. How does an organization know when to build the capability internally versus bringing in the outside partner? Or where do you see that go wrong in making that assessment as well in your research?
Yeah, because Alloy Partners is actually a venture building partner, right?
Yeah, it's very selfishly. We do this often, so I think it's helpful. We get the pushback a lot of internal studios that have been running and aren't running very effectively, and they come to us and they say, "How are you able to launch X amount of companies a year? Come and help us." And I think what they struggle with is most companies, their default is we should do this on our own. This should be an internal capability that we should own. And oftentimes we were talking to them after the fact usually. And so I think that that's where helpful just to how should corporations be more reflective and introspective around taking a look in the mirror and saying, where do we actually have gaps here?
I think it's always really helpful to bring in external perspectives, whether that's a venture building partner, it might be an EAR, it might be portfolio founders that are external and that can shake things up a bit, because what you need is a fresh pair of eyes sometimes on these matters. Because I think large organizations are sometimes very biased, and that's what we've seen a lot, is that they think they have something, but then there is just not enough of it. It's just a fault, and it's a way of perceiving themselves as an organization. So I think there's a way to do this well in collaborating with external partners. And where it goes wrong is actually in the evaluation of an organization and the integration of externally developed ideas. So when I say the evaluation of the organization, is that an external partner obviously does not know the organization as well as the corporate itself does. And so sometimes it's really hard for an external partner to identify the assets the organization has, or what is actually possible, or what it is not going as well. Because maybe the corporation is not as honest, maybe they just simply don't know themselves. And so there's a lot of work that an external partner has to do. And I know that because I've worked with organizations myself. And when we talk about how to design a venture building program or how to change it and how to do that in a way that is efficient, a lot of times I come in and there's just not much to work with. Which is fine, right? Because then you can actually do your own assessments and evaluations. And I use a mix of quantitative and qualitative data to actually understand how well the organization is doing. and what is feasible in terms of venture building. And then you can compare that to knowledge from the field of what are other venture studios in the same field doing, and how can you then apply that to that organization that I would work with. In terms of integration, it's really around, for example, if in your case you are building a company externally, how is that being integrated back into the corporation? And so sometimes what we see is that the governance mechanisms and structures are actually not aligned in a way where the corporation can absorb and connect those ideas back into the corporation. And so the whole system breaks down or it gets lost, right? And that's oftentimes very sad, which is more of an acquisition base because there's a lot of value and work that has been done. And then it just sort of ends up dying in the organization. So I think thinking about what the company, if it is more of a company acquisition, right, what that purpose of that company would be once it's inside the organization, that's very important. And having the right governance processes in place.
I completely agree. I think a lot of it depends too on what is, the ultimate goal of the studio and the strategic vision for the company. Is it around learning? Is it around growth? I think our position and where we work really well is always around external venture building. And so we want to build net new startups that live outside of the corporation, that leverage the governance, the equity structure, the lack of rules and governance and regulation even that exists usually at the large corporation, but that a startup can move at startup speed and at startup rules and be able to do things that the corporation could not. I mean, one great example right now is everything just with AI and agentic systems and OpenClaw and everything. No Fortune 500 is going to let that run rampant in the organization, and they shouldn't, where a tiny one-person startup has more or less nothing to lose. They're trying to live or die by, can we make it out into market and find product market fit? And there's just a whole different level of scrappiness and inability there in that startup. In your research, you've gone over some cautionary tales as well. You have a handful of examples: AmFam's 10110, BP Launchpad, General Mills, G-Works, despite producing viable new ventures, have all been spun down, usually after strategic direction has changed or executive buy-in has changed. But what do the ones that have gotten killed over the years have in common? And at what point in a studio's life does it become survivable where the leadership can't just pull the plug anymore? And what are some lessons that you can provide to other folks either looking to start brand new studios within corporations or that are running studios today around how to use those cautionary tales?
I think that's a really interesting question, because what you also said is that, well, actually they did have viable ventures, right? And so the issue is then not formal, because on paper they do what they say they should do. It's more structural.
Yeah.
And so I think often what we've seen is that there can be a lack of long-term commitment. Venture building just takes time. It's a 5 to 10-year commitment at least, and corporate priorities can shift very, very fast. And then you also mentioned leadership changes, right? Huge one, because a lot of times the corporate venture studio is actually a sort of pet project of the CEO. And if the CEO changes, obviously that pet project won't survive. And these units are usually the first ones that get cut if funding changes, priorities changes, or if the CEO changes. And it sort of leads me to my next point is, when the CEO changes, it's really an issue because that means it has not become everyone's priority, right? If that was a pet project solely pursued as a pet project. But venture building should be everyone's business, and innovation should be ingrained in the company. So everyone has to be equally involved and on board. And I think there's a cultural aspect to that too, right? That innovation should be really everyone's business, and internal venture studios should also be internal, not operating somewhere on the outskirts, unless people are operating with someone like you, right? It's sort of a bridge between external and internal. That's a different scenario. But I'm talking about, if you want to have an internal venture studio, that should be some place where a venture studio is actually linked to the corporate in order to utilize the corporate's data and resources and access. and also legitimacy, and not some weird experiment that is just not really integrated very well. And I think culture also within the studio needs to be sort of scrappy and testy and experimental. And I think what you said earlier around the fact that, well, of course, corporates don't want to integrate it because it's very risky in the beginning. I think a venture studio can be an excellent way to actually be an entrepreneurial test bed and to commit a few resources, kill fast, and experiment. And I think this aspect of killing fast is actually really important. And we see that there are some venture studios that do this really well. For example, Google X, right? They have this whole culture of killing things fast and rewarding them through peer recognition, managerial and bonus incentives, right? So the people that proceed fast and move along fast, they actually get rewarded, which is very rare in corporate cases. But I think adopting such a culture is actually very helpful. And I think maybe the third thing that we can learn is actually governance misalignment, is that studios are often expected to operate entrepreneurially, but they are evaluated by corporate metrics that don't fit the model at all. And that goes back to this entrepreneurial testbed analogy, right? Like, how would you measure if something like that is actually successful? And the way we say you should do that is actually not just by financial metrics, but maybe by strategic metrics, right? Like, how many partnerships did you build? The portfolio metrics, how many ventures were launched, but also how many ideas were killed in the process. And I think there's also a learning aspect to that, right? Organizations can do this in order to learn about entrepreneurship. And there is a sort of messiness component that should be considered when you do that. The real questions I think organizations need to just ask upfront is not just, can we do this, right? Do we have the resources? But can we actually commit to this long term? And can we make the organizational changes that a model like this would require? And I think there's easier ways to do innovation, right? It's very long term. It can be resource intensive, but it could just start with an EIR program. But it's a big commitment still to have a venture studio. I think venture building is just one of the most demanding approaches to innovation, and it just should be considered carefully if that's something one wants to do.
I couldn't agree more. I think oftentimes in our business that we have picked the hardest lane to operate in, and in one of the hardest sectors. It's 10 times easier to just be a venture capitalist, but we decided that we want to do this the hard mode only. But our thesis is that we think, though, that the companies that we can start, the portfolio we can build, because it comes attached to these amazing corporations and the advantages that they bring to these companies, it makes the portfolio so much more valuable. And that is the unique unlock in our proprietary deal flow and our unique nature that can provide returns outside what we see just within traditional venture. And so it is hard mode when you pursue this path. And I think it's something worth saying out loud. We've spoken here the last handful of minutes, particularly just around the corporate angle of this. You're doing a lot of work now with MIT's Proto Ventures as well, which I've had a handful of their venture builders in team and talked to them on the podcast even as well, which was a ton of fun to dive into more on the deep tech side of things and some of the ideas that they're working on. You've studied venture building on both sides of this, corporations and universities. Maybe share just a little bit from your perspective on what does a university have that a corporation can never fully replicate, and what do corporations have that the universities never fully can replicate?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be so well represented. That's great. I think universities fundamentally have a lot of IP, and there's a lot of knowledge, and there's this constant influx of talent. But what we see, and that's part of my research, is they have a hard time commercializing the scientific inventions into commercial applications. And for instance, Proto Ventures doesn't promise or take equity, which actually is very nice for the PIs of the labs and the students because it creates interest and motivation because they don't need to give anything up. But that also makes it harder when you're trying to partner with corporate partners. And I think on the other side of the spectrum, you have corporates that have structures that are aligned with profit. But I think a lot of times it might be a little bit less relevant because they don't have that. They have their structures in place and are somewhat profit-making machines, but sometimes you can lose sight of what is actually happening in the wild and in the real world. So for instance, I was recently working with Fidelity, and Fidelity is its own market, right? Even if the company builds a company inside the company, it survive just by serving Fidelity. And that's a really interesting thought, which a lot of startups just have to go to different types of partners, and they have to experience who is my customer actually. And I think that is the change or the difference when it comes to building within a corporate. I think venture studios essentially sit between that world where you try to be profit aligned, and in the cases of deep tech and research-driven innovation, you also try to actually get people interested that are constantly creating new ideas. And Proto Ventures is an example of an organization that has tried that. I think if designed well, this can work, because in an ideal scenario, corporates can fund such studios on campus without immediate profit or equity commitments. But then, as we've seen, that is oftentimes a little bit hard, right? So, for example, Proto Ventures would mostly take philanthropic funding because that's just more aligned with profit interests. But I do think, and that's something we're working on, is designing a model that can suit both needs. And that's really the crux of it, right? Is that can we try and design something that serves both worlds?
I have been using this term internally a lot around research co-creation. We work with and partner with and co-operate a couple of university-based venture studios, one of which is with the University of Notre Dame called 1842. And we talk a lot about this idea of research co-creation, of working with researchers at the university and co-creating these startups with industry partners at the same time. And we've done that a handful of times. There's something magical there where university is flush with IP and ideas and technology that is just sitting on the shelf. And how do we translate that into commercial viability and bringing along industry partners that have the market insights, that have the problems uniquely that they see is really powerful. Aligning those two, though, to your point, because of the nature of their business models, of their mission at the end of the day, can be hard sometimes. But it is something that we continue to endeavor to do, and it is a unique spot to be in. A lot of the examples that show up in your research, a lot of your background even in particular, are centered around deep tech, nuclear fission and semiconductor cooling, carbon capture, hard sciences. How does the venture studio model adapt when you're building in deep tech in particular? And do you think studios are actually maybe better suited even to that world than traditional consumer-based applications and B2B software and traditional kind of venture capital that's been funding those types of products for decades?
I think in some ways they are. And I think you are a good example of that, right? Where you collaborate with universities and you try to bring in corporate partners in the research co-creation. I think if they are designed correctly, deep tech and venture building they go hand in hand. Because deep tech requires these like really long timelines, high funding, coordination across multiple domains, and structured experimentation. Whereas traditional venture capital, they often struggle with this fact that a lot of it is heavily founder dependent. And also they're used to shorter time horizons than deep tech is. I think venture studios, by contrast, they allow you to build multiple companies in parallel, systematically test ideas, and then you can allocate these resources in a dynamic way. So it's a little bit more flexible. And what we've seen as well is that you can actually create whole industries with that. For example, if we take fusion technology, that there's many components that are missing in order to create a fusion reactor, right? And if we understand the components that are missing, can we then create these components by ourselves? So it's around ecosystem building, actually, which a VC doesn't do. An accelerator, they accelerate existing ideas, but a venture studio, there's a little bit more planning and strategic foresight in that. So I think what I've found is that model can be particularly well suited for tackling really complex high uncertainty problems. And that's also where a lot of my current research is focused, right? Is like how venture building can actually be used as a mechanism to address these large societal challenges. And me and my Professor Fiona Murray, we're doing a project on what we call the Deep Tech Observatory, where the idea is to actually map out different types of data and data layers that go into such deep tech companies. And the question is that if we believe that a deep tech company or that a company is different resources, and we believe that a venture studio can recombine these resources, can we map out these separate resources and lay a path for recombination to address specific challenges? In our case, those are security challenges or resilience challenges, but could be anything really. And that's really my thought on, can we then design models and systems where you can match solutions and problems more efficiently, which I think is what a venture studio allows us to do.
It's the ecosystem opportunity is huge. The compounding effects, the ability to run things in parallel. We're finding that right now. We're about to publish a piece here today, actually around one of our studios, and we're in parallel running 9 different concepts, specifically focused on plant, animal, and human health and the convergence of these 3. And I would say the stage gates they're very apparent too, where in software, they're not quite as deterministic at least. And so I think that's too and unique within hard tech and deep tech. You can run a lot more of these in parallel. And I think things like AI and where we're heading in the future make that dramatically more cost effective as well, dramatically shorten the life of being able to come to those aha stage gate moments as well. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there for these studios to build really unique and novel solutions to some of these things, which is a ton of fun. I have one closing question around just where do you think venture studios are going in the future? Do you think this becomes a more standard part of an organization or university's innovation portfolio, or do you think this becomes more of a niche tool that companies will try or that will sit on the outside? But where do you think, based on all the research you've done, where do you think this is heading?
I think the term venture studio might evolve over time, but we're seeing a sort of evolution, right? From incubator to accelerator to very hands-on accelerator to venture studio. And it's this notion that capital alone is no longer enough, or network alone is no longer enough. There needs to be a sort of hands-on aspect to things. I think that aspect is really around the curation and the pooling of resources, people, and ideas, because an amazing person might not have the idea, but if you combine those two, that's already venture building in some ways. I think the real fault that we've had is that the real advantage is actually shifting towards something that can be systematically coordinated and translate resources into new companies. And I think that is happening already. That will continue to happen. And we're seeing that happen more and more with deep tech, especially in areas around that, but also in areas where resources are scarcer because you need more sort of coordination. And I think it's a much more organizational capability rather than an individual one. And so it's just a sort of testament of the evolution of how these structures have changed over time. And I'm not sure, what the next 10 years will hold. I think AI is a very interesting capability, and it will also accelerate venture building capabilities as well. And I'm excited to see actually how that will all play out and how it will impact it. My hope would be that venture studios become their own asset class with a sort of set rules of definitions and set structures so that we all align. And also that there is a little bit more regulation in that area, because I think right now, as we mentioned before, there's just a lot of noise still. And that is historic, but it's also, I think it's still ongoing. And so having clarity around that will be a good thing.
I just want to say thank you again for time. Thanks for spending time with me, unpacking a lot of the research you've done over the last 5 years. It's been incredible to get to know you, and this was an amazing conversation. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was very interesting.